am 32 years old, and I have spent exactly 11,680 days trapped behind a tongue that refuses to cooperate. My name is Alara, and to the world of regional real estate, I am the administrative shadow of the Vance Empire. While my father and brother occupy the glass offices on the 40th floor, I occupy a desk in the basement annex, managing a portfolio of 600 commercial leases for an hourly wage of $28. I am not on the board. I do not have equity. I am the daughter who is seen but rarely heard, because when I speak, the air catches in my throat, turning a simple good morning into a 3-second battle. My identity is defined by the silence I keep to avoid the pitying winces of strangers. But silence isn't emptiness. It's observation. I know every zoning loophole in the tri-state area and the exact expiration date of every contract my family signs. Today, the stakes changed. My grandfather, the man who built every brick of this company after arriving here with nothing but a crate of tools and a relentless will, has been moved to palliative care. The vultures aren't circling yet. They're already in the lobby, checking their watches. The tension snapped the moment I walked into the executive suite this morning. My father didn't look up from his monitor. "Alara, the Henderson files need filing by 5. Your brother is handling the press release regarding your grandfather's transition. Transition. That was the word they used for a dying man's final breaths. I wanted to tell him that the Henderson files were already finished, that I had saved the company $4 million in tax credits last night while he was at dinner. I opened my mouth, but the F sound stalled. I just nodded. The humiliation wasn't in the silence. It was in the fact that he didn't even wait for me to try. My brother Julian is 28, looks like a cinematic lead, and has never read a full contract in his life. He walked into the annex an hour later, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the unearned confidence of a man who has been told, yes, since birth. He dropped a stack of papers on my desk, the results of my 6-month deep dive into the downtown redevelopment project. "Great work on this, Alara," he said, flashing the smile that gets him out of speeding tickets. "Dad loved the zoning strategy. I presented it to the investors this morning as my growth initiative. They're sold." He didn't ask if he could take credit. He simply informed me that he already had. This is the Vance family dynamic. I provide the structural integrity, and Julian provides the paint job. He is the future of the family, the charismatic heir who can charm a city council into a rezoning miracle, while I am the ghost who found the legal precedent to make it possible. The conflict isn't just about the stolen work, it's the erasure. As he leaned over my desk, he didn't see a partner or a sister, he saw a tool. "Don't look so sour," he chuckled, noticing my tightened jaw. "You hate the spotlight anyway. It's better this way. I handle the people, you handle the paper." He turned to leave, tossing a casual remark over his shoulder about the family dinner tonight. "Try to be on time. Dad's making a big announcement about the restructuring now that Grandpa is, out of the picture." He left the room before I could even draw the breath to respond. My hands trembled over the keyboard, not from sadness, but from the sudden, sharp realization that my father was planning to hand over the keys to a man who couldn't tell a land trust from a leasehold. At 94 years old, my grandfather, Arthur Vance, is the only person in this family who ever looked at me and didn't see a broken machine. He arrived at Ellis Island in 1952 with a set of rusted chisels and a vocabulary of 40 English words. Today, his name is etched into the cornerstones of 36 skyscrapers across the city. He is a man of jagged edges and brutal silences, a pioneer who built a real estate empire by outworking men who had the advantage of birthright. My father and Julian treat his legacy like a prize to be divided, but to me, Arthur is the architect of my survival. He was the one who taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by the fluidity of their speech, but by the weight of their word. The tension shifted from the office to the sterile halls of St. Jude's private wing. My father views this hospital stay as a logistical hurdle, a delay in the paperwork of succession. He sees a fading asset. I see the man who once spent 3 hours sitting with me in a park, patiently waiting for me to finish a single sentence about a bird I'd seen, never once interrupting or finishing my thoughts for me. Now, the roles have reversed. He is the one trapped in a body that won't obey, his breathing regulated by a machine that bellows like a forge. As I walked into his suite tonight, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the unsaid. My father was on his phone in the corner, arguing about a bridge loan, treating the ICU like a satellite office. He didn't even acknowledge me. I moved to the bedside, taking Arthur's calloused hand in mine. His skin felt like parchment, but his grip, usually iron, was limp. The stakes are no longer just about who runs the company, they are about who honors the man. If he dies tonight, the last barrier between my brother's ego and the company's destruction dies with him. It is 3:14 a.m. I have been in this plastic chair for 18 hours, a tenure of loyalty that earns me no overtime pay and even less recognition. While Julian is currently at a gala, charming the city's elite and positioning himself as the sympathetic face of a grieving family, I am the one recording the hourly fluctuations of a heart monitor. This is the invisible work of the quiet one. I am the sentinel of the transition, the only person present for the moments that don't make it into the press releases. Before I tell you what I saw in my grandfather's eyes that day, I have to ask, have you ever been the only one to show up when the lights go out? Comment, SDAYED, if you've ever been a silent witness to the truth. The silence of the room was shattered when Julian burst in, tuxedo tie undone, smelling of gin and expensive cigars. He didn't go to the bed. He went to the chart at the foot of it, scanning the vitals like a stock ticker. "How much longer, Alara?" he whispered, his voice devoid of grief, only stained with impatience. "The board is getting twitchy. They need a firm date for the transition meeting. This waiting game is costing us the sterling deal." I stood up, my legs cramping from the long vigil. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that our grandfather was still in there, listening to his heir talk about him like a depreciating piece of equipment. I tried to speak, my chest tightening, but the words, "he is your blood," turned into a choked HHH. Julian just rolled his eyes. "Forget it, just text me if the monitor flats." He left as quickly as he came, a whirlwind of ambition that didn't leave a single footprint of empathy. I turned back to the bed and froze. Arthur's eyes were open. He had heard everything. He couldn't move his head, but his gaze was pinned on me, sharp, lucid, and filled with a terrifyingly cold clarity. He wasn't dying yet, he was judging. And for the first time in my life, I realized he wasn't looking at me with pity, but with the expectation of a soldier waiting for his second-in-command to take the lead. I am the girl who knows the price of everything and the value of $1. While my brother treats the company treasury like a personal fountain, I live on a strict spreadsheet budget, accounting for every gallon of gas in my 10-year-old sedan. At 32, I possess a master's degree in urban planning and a mastery of the Vance ledger that exceeds my father's. Yet I am the only executive-adjacent staff member required to punch a digital time clock. This isn't just about money. It's about the fact that they don't trust me with the keys to the kingdom, because I won't play the game of loud, empty promises. The tension manifested this morning in a stack of overdue maintenance requests Julian had ignored to fund a branding retreat. I was at my desk, authorizing a $12 repair for a tenant's sink, when a man in a bespoke charcoal suit appeared in the doorway of my basement office. He didn't look like a contractor or a tenant. "Ms. Vance," he asked. He didn't flinch when I took a breath to steady my response. "I am Mr. Aris," he said, stepping into the cramped space. He was my grandfather's personal attorney, the one the rest of the family called the Shadow. He didn't hand me a file or a greeting. He simply watched me work for a moment, his eyes scanning the spreadsheets on my dual monitors. Your grandfather told me you were the only one who understood that a skyscraper is only as strong as the dirt it sits on. He didn't explain why he was there. He just left a business card on my desk and told me to keep my phone on. The stakes of my hourly life suddenly felt heavier. The man who handled my grandfather's most private secrets was looking at me like I was the only person in the building who wasn't a ghost. I am the only person who knows the specific temperature my grandfather likes his broth, warm enough to soothe, but not hot enough to scald. It is 6:00 p.m. on a Tuesday, and while the rest of the family is at a downtown steakhouse discussing the post-Arthur era, I am sitting in the dim light of room 402, holding a plastic spoon. My patience is my greatest asset, a discipline forged through decades of waiting for my own voice to catch up to my thoughts. The conflict arrived with the heavy scent of Julian's cologne before he even crossed the threshold. He strode in, not to check on the patient, but to use the hospital's high-speed Wi-Fi. He paced the small room, his voice echoing off the linoleum. "He's still hanging on. Unbelievable," Julian muttered, glancing at the bed as if our grandfather were a flight delay. "I have 3 developers waiting on the liquidity release. If we don't consolidate the land trusts by the end of the quarter, the whole Northside deal collapses. He's being selfish at this point, Alara. He's holding up the future." I froze, the spoon halfway to Arthur's lips. I looked at the bed. My grandfather's eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, his jaw tight. He was fully conscious, absorbing every word of his grandson's betrayal. Julian didn't notice. He was too busy checking his reflection in the window glass, adjusting his silk tie. "I'm going to talk to Dad about the incapacity clause again," Julian said, heading for the door. "We can't let one old man's stubbornness sink the company." The door swung shut, leaving a vibrating silence in its wake. I looked down at my grandfather. A single tear tracked through the deep wrinkles at the corner of his eye. He didn't look at the door. He looked at me. His hand, thin as a bird's wing, reached out and gripped my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. He wasn't asking for help. He was giving an order. The future Julian was so eager to grab was about to hit a wall he didn't even know I had built. I am 32, and for the first time in my life, I am looking at a man who has finished his work. It is 4:12 a.m., the hour when the world is coldest. The machines that had spent weeks screaming on my grandfather's behalf have finally fallen silent, leaving a void in the room that feels heavier than the noise ever did. My role as the bedside sentinel has ended, and as I stand over the man who built a city out of grit and silence, I realize that I am now the sole keeper of his final, unedited truths. The tension didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with a clipboard. Within 20 minutes of the heart monitor's flatline, a night nurse I'd never seen before was asking about disposition of remains and insurance clearance. Before I could even process the stillness of Arthur's hands, my phone vibrated with a text from my father. It wasn't a question about my well-being or a message of grief. It was a directive: secure the safe in his study. Do not let the lawyers in until I arrive. The conflict erupted when I refused to leave. I watched from the window as the first light of dawn hit the skyscrapers Arthur had raised, knowing that by noon, Julian would be drafting the New Era press release. I reached into the small drawer of the nightstand, my fingers brushing against a scrap of yellowed legal pad. On it, in a shaky, aggressive scrawl that must have cost him his final reserves of energy, were 4 words. They talk. You build. I tucked the note into my pocket just as my father's footsteps thundered down the hallway, signaling the start of the harvest. I am the daughter tasked with the logistics of grief, which is a polite way of saying I am the one who handles the funeral directors, so my brother can handle the cameras. It is 3 days after the passing, and the Vance family image is being curated with the precision of a diamond cut. I have spent the last 72 hours answering 600 emails and organizing a motorcade, all while being told to stay in the third car because my nervousness might unsettle the high-profile guests. The conflict reached its peak in the staging area of the cathedral. Julian was adjusting his black armband, practicing a somber expression in a handheld mirror. He looked at me, his eyes flitting over my exhausted face and the simple, affordable dress I'd bought for the occasion. "You're not speaking today, Alara," he said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing a weather report. "Dad and I agreed. We need a strong, clear voice to reassure the investors. We can't have you struggling up there. It looks weak for the brand." I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the stuttered b-but dying before it hit my teeth. I didn't fight him. I didn't have to. I just looked at the crowd of power brokers filling the pews, men who didn't know that the girl in the third row was the only one who had the codes to the very servers they were currently eulogizing. The tension boiled as the service began. Julian took the dais, delivering a soaring, empty speech about legacy and the next generation that he clearly hadn't written. He spoke of Arthur as a mentor, a man who shared everything with him. I sat in the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, my hand resting on the slim folder I'd found tucked inside Arthur's old leather ledger at the office. The world saw a golden heir claiming his throne. I saw a man standing on a trapdoor I was about to trigger. The ballroom of the Grand Excelsior is a sea of black silk and forced laughter. It is precisely 3 weeks since the funeral, and the mourning period has officially been replaced by a strategic gala. At 32, I am the only person in this room who understands that this isn't a party, it's a coronation. My father stands on a stage bathed in amber light, his arm draped over Julian's shoulder, while I am positioned near the service entrance, holding a glass of sparkling water I don't intend to drink. The tension in the air is thick enough to choke on. My father taps a microphone, the sound echoing like a gavel. "To the future," he bellows, his voice projecting the strength he thinks the markets need to see. "Within the year, the Vance Group will consolidate its holdings, and I am proud to announce that my son, Julian, will take the mantle as sole chairman of the board. The empire remains in one pair of capable hands." The party cost more than my annual salary, but as I stood in the corner, I realized the most expensive thing in the room wasn't the champagne. It was the secret I didn't know I was holding. Have you ever felt like a stranger at your own family's table? Comment, ghost, if you've been overlooked while you were the one holding everything together. The room erupted in applause, a thunderous validation of my erasure. Julian beamed, already nodding to developers as if he owned the very floor they stood on. No one looked toward the service entrance. No one saw the woman who had spent the last decade ensuring the foundations beneath those developers didn't crumble. I turned away from the light, the weight of the folder in my bag feeling like a lead weight against my hip. I didn't need their applause. I needed the exit. The transition from the velvet warmth of the gala to the concrete chill of the parking garage is a shock to the system. It is 11:45 p.m., and the echoes of my heels against the pavement sound like a countdown. I am alone, or so I thought, until the headlights of a black sedan flickered in the corner of level P3. Mr. Aris, the lawyer from the basement, stepped out of the shadows, his face an unreadable mask of iron and law. The conflict of the night shifted from public humiliation to private reckoning. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't offer a drink. He simply held out a slim, manila folder, the edges slightly worn. "The party is over, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the hum of the garage's ventilation. "They think they've won because they've secured the titles. They've forgotten that your grandfather was a man who trusted the earth, not the ink on a letterhead." The tension spiked as I reached for the folder. My fingers brushed the paper, and for a moment the stutter in my mind cleared. "WWI now?" I managed to ask, the words coming out jagged but certain. Eris didn't flinch at the sound. He looked at me with a grim sort of respect. Because they are about to consolidate the trusts. They think they are pulling everything into one basket to hand to your brother. They don't realize that your grandfather rigged that basket. He stepped back into his car, the engine purring to life. "Read the land trust deeds, Alara, not the company bylaws, the land." He knew they wouldn't wait for his body to get cold. He made sure you'd be the one standing over the stove. He drove away, leaving me in the dark with a document that felt like a detonator. Sitting on the floor of my studio apartment at 2:00 a.m., surrounded by the blueprints of a coup. My floor is carpeted with legal documents, not the glossy annual reports Julian hands to investors, but the grit of the Vance empire, the land trusts. While my father and brother spent decades chasing the prestige of the buildings, my grandfather was quietly securing the dirt beneath them. I am realizing that in the hierarchy of power, a title is a lease, but ownership of the ground is absolute. The tension in the room is palpable as I trace the flow of assets through the Arthur Vance Legacy Trust. The legal jargon is a thicket, designed to repel anyone looking for a quick payout, but I have spent years translating density into clarity. I discover that the skyscrapers, the branding, and the executive fleet are all held by the corporation, but the ground leases, the actual dirt, are held in private trusts that have remained dormant for 40 years. The conflict clarifies with a single, underlined clause on page 84. My grandfather didn't leave me a seat at the table. He left me the floor the table stands on. The controlling interest in these trusts is not granted by blood or by vote. It is triggered by a specific event. My heart hammers against my ribs as I read the activation requirement. Total consolidation of corporate assets under a single successor. By trying to give Julian everything, my father is inadvertently handing the master key to me. I am the architect of a silence that is about to become a landslide. It is 48 hours before the official board vote, and the office is a whirlwind of activity as the legal team prepares the Unity merger. Julian is already measuring the curtains in our father's office, oblivious to the fact that he is walking into a snare set by a man who died weeks ago. I am currently reconciling the final quarter's property taxes, my fingers steady on the keys, acting the part of the dutiful, invisible daughter while I wait for the clock to run out. The conflict is no longer external. It is the war within my own chest. I could walk into my father's office right now and warn him. I could save them from the humiliation that is coming. But then I remember the soup spoon, the hospital room, and the way they spoke about incapacity while the man was still breathing. I remember the 40-cent per hour raises I had to beg for while Julian crashed a $100,000 car into a retaining wall and laughed it off. The tension peaks when the internal memo hits my inbox. Board meeting, Thursday, 9:00 a.m. Final ratification of succession. There is no mention of me in the agenda. I am not even invited to the room. I look at the slim folder from Mr. Eris, now tucked safely into my briefcase, and realize that my silence hasn't been a weakness. It's been an incubation period. They think they are merging a company. They don't realize they are forfeiting an empire. I have exactly 36 hours to prepare the only speech I have ever cared to deliver. And for the first time, I'm not afraid of the words getting stuck. Today I am wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. It is 8:55 a.m., the final countdown to the board meeting that will decide the fate of the Vance Group. I am standing in front of the frosted glass doors of the executive conference room, a space I have cleaned, organized, and prepared for others, but never occupied as a peer. The air in the hallway is pressurized, humming with the electric anxiety of a corporate shift that has been 50 years in the making. The conflict began at the security desk. A new guard, likely hired by Julian to refresh the image of the lobby, placed a hand on the turnstile as I scanned my badge. "Annex staff aren't permitted on this floor today, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the associate designation on my ID. The stakes were no longer about ego, they were about access. I didn't argue. I didn't struggle for a word. I simply pulled a single, notarized letter from my briefcase signed by Mr. Aris. The tension broke as the guard's eyes widened, his hand dropping from the gate as if it had turned white-hot. I stepped into the elevator alone. As the numbers climbed toward 40, I watched my reflection in the polished chrome. I didn't see the shadow or the quiet one anymore. I saw the only person who had bothered to read the fine print of our family's history. The doors slid open to a room full of men in charcoal suits, and as I walked toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, the room went deathly silent. I am the daughter who has been edited out of every family success story for a decade. It is 9:15 a.m., and my father is standing at the head of the mahogany table, his face flushed with the triumph of a man who thinks he has just secured his dynasty. Julian is sitting to his right, leaning back with a proprietary air, tapping a gold pen against a leather-bound folder. They both look at me not with anger, but with a weary, condescending pity, as if I am a child who wandered into a Broadway play by mistake. My father looked at me with pity. He told the board I was emotional and unsteady because of my speech. If you've ever been silenced by someone who thought they were better than you, type loud in the comments. Watch what happens when the quiet one finally finds her voice. The tension reached a breaking point when my father cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the board members. "Forgive my daughter," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "She's had a difficult time since the funeral. Alara, honey, we're about to sign the consolidation. Why don't you wait in my office? I'll have my assistant bring you some tea." The conflict ignited the moment I didn't move. I stood up, the legs of the heavy chair screeching against the hardwood. I felt the familiar tightening in my throat, the tea in the threatening to lock my jaw. I took a breath, not a panicked one, but a measured, tactical one. I placed the slim folder from the parking garage on the center of the table and slid it toward the lead director. The consolidation cannot proceed," I said. My voice was low and the stutter was there, a sharp staccato beat, but it didn't stop me. "You are trying to merge a company into a vacuum. You own the buildings, father, but you forgot who owns the land." For the first time in this boardroom, I am the only person who isn't breathing through a mask of panic. It is 9:28 a.m. The lead director is hunched over the documents I provided, his spectacles perched on the tip of his nose as he traces the flow of assets through the land trusts. My father's hand is hovering over the consolidation agreement, his signature half-finished, frozen by the sudden, heavy realization that his pen no longer carries the weight of law. The conflict erupted when Julian lunged for the folder, his face contorting from smug confidence to a desperate, jagged rage. "This is a fabrication," he shouted, his voice cracking as it hit the soundproofed walls. "She's a data entry clerk. She doesn't have the standing to present these." He tried to snatch the deeds, but the director pulled them back with a sharp, protective movement. The room was no longer a theater of succession. It was a crime scene of corporate negligence. The tension spiked as the director looked up, his face ashen. "It's not a fabrication, Julian," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ground leases for the downtown portfolio, the Northside development, and this very building are held by the land trusts, and the trusts aren't owned by the corporation." He turned his gaze toward me, a new, terrifying respect in his eyes. "They are triggered by the attempt to consolidate, and according to these bylaws, the controlling interest just transferred to Alara." I watched my brother's gold pen roll off the table and clatter onto the floor, a small, metallic funeral bell for his ambition. I am the woman who spent years being talked over, now presiding over a silence so absolute I can hear the hum of the HVAC system. It is 9:45 a.m. The board members are staring at me, waiting for me to falter, waiting for the stutter to reclaim the space. But as I look at the empty chair where my grandfather once sat, I feel a strange, cold iron in my spine. I am no longer fighting to be heard. I am simply delivering the verdict of a man who saw everything. The conflict shifted from legalities to a desperate emotional plea. My father slumped into his seat, his broad shoulders looking suddenly frail. "He wouldn't do this," he muttered, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the quiet daughter he thought he knew. "Arthur loved this company. He wouldn't let a girl who can't even lead a staff meeting hold the assets hostage." It was the final insult, the dying gasp of a man who believed power was about volume. The tension broke when the director pulled a sealed envelope from the back of the folder, a final missive from the architect himself. He read the words aloud, a voice from the grave that silenced the room. "My son builds monuments to his own name. My grandson builds monuments to his own ego. But my granddaughter builds the foundation. She listened when no one else did. She is the only one who knows what it costs to keep the lights on." The validation didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a heavy, sacred mantle. I didn't need to shout to prove my father wrong. The man who built the empire had already spoken for me. I am the one holding the oxygen in the room. It is 10:10 a.m. The power dynamic has shifted so violently that the air feels thin. My father is staring at his reflection in the polished mahogany, and Julian is pacing the perimeter of the rug like a caged animal. I have the legal right to evict the company from its own headquarters, to liquidate the land and walk away with a fortune that would dwarf their combined inheritance. But I am not a vulture. I am a steward. The conflict arrived when I pushed a second, smaller document across the table. "I am not here to destroy," I said, my voice steady despite the rhythmic hitch in my breath. "I am here to protect what he built." I proposed a split. Julian could keep his title and the public-facing operations, the cameras, the galas, the press releases he craved, while I would retain absolute control over the assets and the land trusts. It was a partnership of necessity, a chance for the family to survive its own greed. The tension vibrated as I waited for a response. I was offering them a lifeline disguised as a compromise. I watched Julian's eyes dart from the map of our holdings to the board members, his ego visibly warring with his survival instinct. He looked at the director, then back at me, his lip curling in a sneer that lacked its usual bite. He wasn't looking for a way to work with me. He was looking for a loophole I hadn't left. I am the silent witness to the end of an era. It is 10:35 a.m., and the board of directors is preparing to vote on my proposal. The room is divided by more than just a table. It is split between the old guard who followed my father's charisma and the pragmatists who now realize I hold the keys to their pensions. The stakes are binary. Either they accept a shared leadership with a woman they've ignored for a decade, or they watch the Vance Group dissolve into a heap of legal fees and tenant lawsuits. The conflict reached its peak when my father stood up, his face a mask of wounded pride. He didn't look at the board. He looked at the men he had golfed with for 30 years. "If you vote for this," he warned, his voice trembling with a desperate, fading authority, "you are handing the legacy to a girl who won't even speak to the shareholders. You are choosing a ghost over a leader." He was trying to invoke the old fear of my silence, but he forgot that ghosts are the ones who know where the bodies are buried. The tension snapped as the lead director called for the motion. One by one, the hands went up, not for my father, but for the security of the land. The vote was a landslide, but not for the unity my father had planned. It was a vote for the foundation. When the final tally was recorded, my father slowly gathered his things and walked out of the room without a word, leaving Julian standing alone at the head of a table he no longer controlled. The golden boy was still wearing the crown, but I was the one who owned the kingdom. The silence of the executive suite has changed its frequency. It is 5:00 p.m., and the heavy thud of my father's boxes being loaded into a freight elevator echoes through the vents. The boardroom is empty now, save for the lingering scent of stale coffee and the ghosts of a dynasty that believed volume was the same as validity. My brother remains in his office, the door locked, his chairman title intact, but his authority reduced to a decorative flourish. He has the stage, but I have the script. The conflict of the day has shifted from a battle for land to a battle for the future. Julian emerged for a moment, his eyes rimmed with red, looking at me not with the old condescension, but with a hollow, terrified realization. He finally understood that every contract he signs, every handshake deal he makes, must now pass through the basement annex for my seal of approval. He is a king without a treasury, a face on a billboard with no ground to stand on. As my brother walked out, he didn't even look at me. He had the title, but I had the keys. It's funny how the people who crave the spotlight are the first to burn out when the power goes off. Are you building a title, or are you building a legacy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading every one of them tonight. The tension peaked as I walked past the mahogany desk that had been my father's for 30 years. I didn't sit in it. I didn't need the leather throne to feel the weight of my position. I reached into my pocket and felt the scrap of yellow paper Arthur had left me. The world thinks the quiet heir was a mistake of birth, a flaw in the Vance bloodline. They don't realize that in a world of noise, the one who doesn't speak is the only one who truly hears the truth. For the first time in 11,680 days, my throat does not feel like a cage. It is twilight, and the city lights are beginning to flicker on, each one a tiny pulse of the empire I now protect. I am sitting in my grandfather's old armchair in his private study, not the executive office, but the wood-paneled room where he actually did his thinking. The stutter is still there, a quiet companion that reminds me of the discipline it took to wait, but it no longer feels like a barrier. It feels like a filter, ensuring that when I do speak, the words are worth the air they consume. The final conflict of my life, the need for external validation, has evaporated. I watched from the window as Julian's car sped away, likely heading to another gala to play the part of the grieving, successful son. Let him have the cameras. Let him have the applause of people who don't know the difference between a facade and a foundation. My stewardship isn't about the future of the family that my father preached. It's about the integrity of the soil Arthur Vance bled for. The tension of the last month has dissolved into a profound, ringing clarity. I opened the heavy leather ledger on the desk and picked up a pen. I am not rewriting the past. I am drafting a new set of rules where the invisible are seen and the quiet are heard. I looked at the photograph of my grandfather on the mantel, the man who saw a builder in a girl who couldn't finish a sentence. I didn't need to shout to win. I just had to stay until the noise stopped. I am Alara Vance, and I am finally, perfectly, at peace with the silence.